Unsettled winter of 1812, the Illinois Territory was still a harsh and unclaimed land, where the wind blew with the sting of hardship and the silence of isolation. Towns were little more than clusters of cabins with dirt roads and flickering lanterns. News traveled slower than the rivers, and justice was often delayed by distance or lost in the wild. It was in this backdrop, one frost-bitten evening, that a teenage girl walked into the frontier town of Vandalia, barefoot, bleeding, and holding the hand of a child who wasn't hers. No one knew where she had come from. She didn't speak much, and when she did, her voice was hoarse, as if her words had to fight their way out of her throat. The girl said her name was Mercy, just Mercy. No last name, no family history, no explanation. The only other thing she said that day was that the child with her, barely 3 years old, with tangled blonde hair and red cheeks, was named Sarah, and that she would rather die than let anyone take her away. They were both ragged and starved, shadows of what children should be. The pastor's wife took them in out of Christian duty, and when asked again for her surname or background, Mercy only said, "I don't remember," but her eyes told a different story. They weren't the eyes of a forgetful child. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. In time, the townspeople grew curious. Some whispered she had escaped a brothel incident. Louis, others thought she was the daughter of a native woman and a French fur trader. Some speculated she had run from a war-torn home, or worse, from something too evil to speak of. But no matter how loud the rumors became, Mercy remained quiet, tending to Sarah like a mother. Not out of obligation, but out of fierce, desperate love. She never begged. She never asked for favors. Instead, she worked. She swept the floors of the chapel, carried firewood, milked goats, and mended torn clothes. Eventually, she started taking on work that most others wouldn't, watching the children of nearby families when they needed to leave the homestead. Some evenings she'd walk 3 miles in the snow to care for a sick child, then walk back before sunrise to fetch water from the well for the pastor's wife. Despite her youth, she was strong. She never cried, not even when the cold cracked her hands or the children misbehaved. Mercy never lost her patience. Her silence became her armor, and her loyalty became her language. Yet even among the kindness she received in Vandalia, she was never fully accepted. She didn't belong to any family. No birth certificate, no origin, just a name and a child. People didn't know whether to fear her, pity her, or admire her. But one thing became clear. Mercy protected children like a wolf protects her cubs. One day, a drunk trader raised his voice at a little girl who spilled ink on his coat during lessons. Mercy had been nearby, sweeping the schoolhouse floor. She didn't speak. She didn't shout. She just stepped between the man and the child, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Not in front of me." Her voice was calm, but something in her tone made the man step back. He left without another word. Word of that moment spread faster than the trader's cart could roll. From then on, people began hiring Mercy not just to watch their children, but to protect them. She never charged more. She never stayed long enough to grow attached. She came in the evenings, often with Sarah asleep on her back, and sat by the fireplace with her carving knife and Bible. Sometimes she read aloud. Sometimes she sang lullabies no one else had ever heard. But always, when the clock neared midnight, she would rise and walk the home's perimeter. She checked windows, she checked doors, and then she would sit, lantern glowing, eyes open wide. Mercy was no ordinary girl. She may not have had a last name, but she had purpose, and in a town where justice came late and safety was rare, a girl like Mercy was more valuable than gold. She didn't come from legacy. She built her own, quietly in the shadows after midnight. For most people in Vandalia, midnight was a time of deep rest, when the last candle was blown out, the fire dimmed, and the world exhaled. But for Mercy, midnight was the opposite. It wasn't a quiet hour, it was a dangerous one. It wasn't when the world rested, it was when it became most alive with hidden threats. To her, midnight was never just a number on the clock, it was a memory. Long before she arrived in Illinois, Mercy had known the sound of footsteps creeping across a wooden floor when the world thought everyone was asleep. She knew how fear could wake you up before your body even moved. She had learned to listen for the weight in the steps, drunken, heavy, violent. She had felt her heart pound in her throat, not from a bad dream, but from the sound of a real nightmare standing right outside her door. She never said much about where she came from, but those close enough to notice her body language, the way she flinched at loud knocks, the way she turned her face slightly every time a man entered the room, could tell that her past wasn't just dark, it was dangerous. And always the danger had come at night. In Mercy's world, midnight meant eyes wide open. In Vandalia, after she had earned a place as the town's unofficial protector of children, she created a habit that no one quite understood at first. When she babysat, she wouldn't sleep, not fully, not ever, no matter how safe the house was, no matter how far the cabin stood from the road. When the clock struck 12, Mercy would rise like it was instinct. She would wrap her shawl tighter, light a small lantern, and check every window, every lock, every doorway. Sometimes she'd sit by the hearth with a blade in her lap, not to use, but to remind herself that she had a choice now. That she wasn't powerless anymore, that whatever had once haunted her at midnight would never reach the children in her care. People started to notice. Children would whisper, "Miss Mercy guards us all night long." Mothers began sleeping easier when she watched their kids, knowing that Mercy would be up, listening, watching. What was once seen as strange slowly became something sacred. Midnight became Mercy's hour of protection, not paranoia. But more than that, midnight became her mirror. It was the time she faced her fears alone, without a crowd, without applause. It was when she stared at the flames and asked herself the questions she never spoke out loud. Who am I, really? What did I run from? Could I have saved them? Could I have saved myself? And every night she came to the same quiet conclusion. Maybe she couldn't change what happened before, but she could make sure it didn't happen again. Not to Sarah, not to any child under her watch. That silent promise became her identity. She didn't need a last name or a family tree. Her name was Mercy, and midnight was her battlefield. There were times the memories came back with violent force. She'd see shadows move outside the window and grip the arms of her chair until her knuckles turned white. She'd hear a child cry out in their sleep, and her heart would stop, as if she were back in some other place, where crying meant danger, not dreams. But then she'd breathe. She'd touch the wool of the child's blanket, feel the heat of the fire, and remind herself, this is not the past. I am not powerless now. I'm not that scared little girl anymore. Midnight for most was the edge of a new day, but for Mercy it was a gate, the narrow place between who she had been and who she was becoming. It was the hour where she chose not to be broken by her history, but shaped by it. Her pain didn't disappear, it became purpose. She never told anyone the full story behind her fear of midnight. She didn't need to. Her actions told it all. She was the girl who stayed awake so others could sleep. She was the one who kept the darkness from crossing the threshold. She was the protector born from pain, not privilege, and slowly the town stopped seeing her as just a poor orphan girl with a mysterious past. They began to see her as something far more powerful, Mercy, the girl who turned midnight into a shield. It was October of 1812. The wind howled like an omen across the open fields, shaking shutters and rattling the thin walls of the log homes in Vandalia. The trees stood bare, stripped by the changing season, and the moon hid behind thick clouds as if it, too, didn't want to witness what was coming. That night, Mercy was caring for the Miller children, 2 boys and 1 baby girl. Their parents had ridden off earlier that day to care for a dying uncle 3 towns away, leaving Mercy in charge for 2 nights. It was a responsibility she accepted without question. She'd watched the Miller children many times before. They loved her stories, trusted her calming voice, and slept easily in her presence. But something about that night was different. Even before the sun fully set, Mercy felt the weight in the air, a tension that pulled at her skin like static. She couldn't explain it, not logically. It wasn't a noise or a scent. It was a feeling, an instinct born from years of surviving the worst in silence, so she prepared. Once the children were asleep, she did what she always did, checked the windows, bolted the doors, and kept her small blade tucked in her apron pocket. She placed a burning log into the hearth to keep the room warm, lit the lantern beside her, and settled into the rocking chair by the door. She didn't dare sleep, not on a night like this. As the clock crept past 11, the wind grew louder, pressing hard against the cabin walls. Mercy's grip on the wooden armrest tightened with every creak of the floorboards, though no one else was moving. Midnight came, then the silence deepened, and that's when she heard it: footsteps, slow, calculated, crunching over frost. Covered leaves outside the cabin. Her breath stopped. The steps didn't belong to an animal. They weren't clumsy or hesitant, they were deliberate. She reached for the lantern and dimmed the flame slightly. Her heart thudded in her chest, but her face remained calm. Then came the whisper, a low, muffled voice outside the front door. "You still up in there, girl?" The voice slurred slightly, drunk and mocking. "Heard there's no man home tonight. Ain't right, leaving a sweet little thing like you all alone." Mercy said nothing. She didn't move. She just listened as the handle twisted. Once, twice. Locked, thank God, but the man didn't stop. She heard him shuffle to the side of the cabin, mumbling curses. Then the sharp sound of a window creaking. Mercy stood and moved toward the nursery. She couldn't risk waking the children with noise. She couldn't risk a scream. The window near the fireplace, where the man now attempted entry, gave a soft thud as his boot touched the frame. He was halfway through when she struck. With one arm, she knocked the lantern off the table, sending a flare of light and flame toward the window, startling the intruder. With her other, she grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and struck his shoulder hard, throwing him off balance. He fell backward with a grunt, landing outside in the frost, clutching his arm. Mercy didn't scream. She didn't call for help. There was no one close enough to hear. She simply stood tall in the window frame, poker still in hand, face lit only by the flickering firelight. "If you ever come near this home again," she said coldly, "you'll wish you hadn't." The man, dazed, bleeding from a scrape on his cheeks, staggered up and ran into the woods. She stood there for several minutes afterward, unmoving, the fire crackling behind her, her breath slow and steady. The next morning, the man was found injured and half frozen near the old mill, mumbling nonsense about a witch who came out of the shadows. But the townspeople knew the truth. Mercy had stopped evil at the door. And when word spread, they didn't call her a hero. They called her something stranger, something whispered at church and around fireplaces, the babysitter who kills after midnight, not because she took a life, but because she stopped one from taking another. Because she drew a line that even the devil himself wouldn't cross. Because she proved that bravery doesn't roar, it watches in silence, waits with wisdom, and strikes with conviction. That night, Mercy didn't just protect the Miller children. She protected every child in town. She reminded everyone that strength doesn't come from power. It comes from pain that has been redeemed. After the attack at the Miller house, everything in Vandalia changed. People still went about their daily routines, milking cows, tending to fields, hauling water, but their conversations turned to one name, Mercy. Some called her a miracle, others whispered in confusion, suspicion, or even fear. The story of the intruder, the fire poker, and the confrontation spread like wildfire through the settlement. By the time it reached the next town over, the story had already evolved. She wasn't just the orphan girl who saved the children. She had become a living legend, the babysitter who killed after midnight. At first, Mercy didn't understand the weight of the name. She hadn't killed anyone. She hadn't even wanted to hurt the man. Her instinct had been simple: protect the children, keep them safe, make sure the night didn't swallow them the way it had once swallowed her. But the town didn't see it that way. To them, the nickname held both awe and warning. People didn't know the full story, but they didn't need to. In their minds, a girl who came from nowhere, carried no name, and watched children by firelight had somehow defeated evil in its own hour. And whether she used a weapon or a whisper, it didn't matter. In their minds, she had slain something much larger than a man. She had slain fear itself. As the name stuck, reactions split. Some families brought her bread, thanked her with teary eyes, and asked if she'd teach their daughters how to watch over their younger siblings with the same fierce discipline. Others grew wary, eyeing her as they would a wild animal. "That girl's dangerous," one man muttered at the trading post, too calm for her own good. "It ain't natural." Mercy heard them. She always heard them, but she didn't react. She wasn't there to be admired or feared. She was there to finish what had begun the night she ran barefoot through the woods with a toddler clinging to her side. She wasn't sure who that man was who tried to break in. Maybe he was someone from her past. Maybe not, but it didn't matter anymore. He had awakened something inside her that had been sleeping for too long, a truth she could no longer hide. She would never be the girl who ran again. In the weeks that followed, Mercy's routine deepened. Families continued to hire her, sometimes even more than before. But now they left out more than just payment. Some left her hand, stitched gloves. Others left their husbands' old knives, believing she might need them again. Still, she never wore a weapon out in the open. She didn't need to. Her presence alone, her quiet strength, her unwavering gaze, the way she locked every door and checked every child before midnight, was enough to give people peace. It wasn't about violence, it was about vigilance. Mercy had become a guardian in a place where law was distant and trust had to be earned. Ironically, the nickname that had been meant to describe a moment of violence became a symbol of something greater. The babysitter who killed after midnight became a name spoken with reverence, not because she had taken life, but because she had preserved it, because she had stood between innocence and evil and didn't flinch. Because she reminded every girl in town that courage doesn't wait for permission. It rises, quietly, suddenly, when it is most needed. Young girls began to mimic her midnight routine. Some sat up late with oil lamps, watching their younger siblings sleep. Others began carving small wooden sticks like Mercy's poker, keeping them under their pillows. They called them Mercy sticks. Mothers smiled quietly, understanding the deeper truth. Mercy had given their daughters something they never had before: agency. Mercy didn't bask in the attention. She didn't walk taller or speak louder. She simply kept doing what she'd always done. She made sure the children were safe. And every midnight she kept watch, not because she expected danger every night, but because she wanted to be ready the one night it did come back. The truth was, Mercy had killed something that night. She had killed the myth that young girls must be silent victims. She had killed the belief that orphans were weak. She had killed the idea that healing only comes from forgetting. Mercy remembered everything. And still she stood. Before Mercy, Vandalia was like most frontier towns, brave in daylight but cautious by night. It was a place where people lived quietly, trusting the strength of their doors and the distance between cabins to keep danger at bay. They feared bandits, illness, and storms, but the worst fear was the one no one spoke of aloud. The fear that evil could come not from the outside wilderness, but from within their own homes when no one was watching. And then Mercy came. At first, she was just an orphan girl. No last name, no history, just a pair of tired eyes and a baby in tow. But after the night of the attempted break-in at the Miller home, after the man fled bleeding and humiliated into the woods, Mercy's story transformed from rumor into a legend. The tale spread not because of blood, but because of bravery. She hadn't merely reacted. She had stood, unflinching, composed, unapologetically strong. In a town where women were taught to keep their heads down and their voices soft, Mercy shattered the mold without raising her voice once. And that changed everything. The morning after the incident, the town buzzed with questions. Some asked how a girl so young could confront a full, grown man and survive. Others wondered what kind of life she must have lived to know how to fight like that. But buried beneath the curiosity was something deeper, something far more dangerous than fear. Respect. The other women began to take note. They began to talk in quiet corners, not about recipes or supplies, but about preparedness. Mercy checks the windows before she sleeps. One woman said, "I never thought to do that." Another replied, "Maybe we should." And slowly, courage began to spread. The mothers in Vandalia started staying up just a little later when their husbands were away. They began locking their doors tighter, not in paranoia, but in preparation. They asked Mercy to teach their daughters how to move silently at night, how to listen closely, how to defend themselves without becoming hardened. Mercy never spoke like a teacher. She didn't boast. She just showed them what she had learned through pain. She taught them how to keep a lantern close and a blade closer. She showed them how to calm a child without words and how to trust their own instincts in the dark. What had once been a private ritual became a shared discipline. Soon there were girls as young as 11 who began copying her quiet strength. They didn't try to be her. They tried to learn from her. And that was the beginning of something powerful. Mercy's courage didn't puff itself up, it multiplied. Like fire spreading from one candle to another, her example lit something inside the town that no one could extinguish. Even the men, at first confused and even offended by her nickname, began to respect her role. They started to understand that Mercy's strength didn't undermine theirs, it supported it. She was the silent guardian of a town that had once believed it was alone after dark. Now they knew better. It wasn't long before other towns heard of her. Travelers passing through Vandalia would ask where they could find the babysitter who killed after midnight. Some hoped to catch a glimpse of her. Some came to hire her, others just wanted to hear her story from the source. Mercy didn't entertain them, she didn't chase glory, she watched the children, she walked the perimeter, she kept her promise. She never spoke much about what happened that October night, but she spoke often about what could be prevented. She told mothers, you don't need to be fearless, just be ready. She told girls, if you feel something is wrong, don't doubt it. Your instinct is not weakness, it's protection. Years later, some of those girls became women who led their own families, passed down Mercy's habits, and taught their daughters the power of stillness, strength, and silence. And they would say to them before bed, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits by the fire, watching the door. Mercy didn't just defend one home, she changed the mindset of an entire town. She proved that bravery wasn't about being born strong. It was about surviving the worst and choosing to stand anyway. And in doing so, she gave Vandalia more than safety, she gave them the courage to never sleep unguarded again. Years passed. The Illinois Territory slowly became more than just a rugged frontier. It evolved into a place with roads, lawmen, churches, and records. But as the towns grew, so too did the distance between the people and the stories that had once shaped them. Stories like Mercy's. Some say she left Vandalia quietly one spring morning with Sarah, now nearly grown, walking beside her. Others say she remained in the shadows, never seeking credit for the courage she had spread. No grave was ever marked with her name, and no church record ever captured her full story. But Mercy didn't live her life to be remembered in books. She lived it to protect what others overlooked. She didn't need a legacy carved in stone. Hers was carved into people. For decades after she vanished, whispers of her story continued in candlelit homes and hushed voices. There was once a girl who had no name, no family, and no fear. They say she stayed awake while others slept. They say she killed fear with silence. They say she watched over children, not for money, but for mercy. To outsiders it sounded like folklore, but to the women of Vandalia and to the girls who grew up in that cold, wind-bitten town, Mercy was as real as the floorboards beneath their feet. Her habits became tradition, her instincts became teachings, her calm courage in the face of evil became a code of survival passed from one generation to the next. The children she once cared for grew up and told their own children, keep your lantern close after dark. Check the doors before you sleep. Trust the silence. Someone strong may be guarding you. And in those quiet teachings lived Mercy's legacy. She wasn't remembered for killing anyone, because she hadn't. She was remembered for what she stopped, for what she stood against, and for what she protected. She had turned the most feared hour, midnight, into a symbol of hope. She had taken something painful from her own past and shaped it into a shield for others. And perhaps the most powerful part of her legacy was this: she inspired other quiet heroes. In a world that often celebrated loudness, loud power, loud authority, loud aggression, Mercy's strength was silent. It sat by the fire, eyes open, ready. It didn't boast, it didn't ask for recognition, but it acted when it mattered most. In time, other girls followed in her footsteps, not to fight, not to become warriors, but to become watchers. Protectors, listeners, they learned that bravery could be soft, spoken. that defending the weak didn't always require fists. Sometimes it required a stillness so steady that evil itself would hesitate. Mercy's impact wasn't measured in grand events. It was measured in small victories that rippled out. A teenage girl who refused to stay silent when she saw something wrong in her own home. A mother who chose to stay up through the night to comfort her child's nightmares rather than ignore them. A teacher who noticed a quiet student's tears and pulled them aside instead of dismissing them. These weren't dramatic acts. They didn't make headlines, but they mattered, because every time someone stood between darkness and innocence, Mercy's spirit lived again. Eventually, her story reached other towns. Different names were added to the tale, different places swapped in. But one detail always remained: the babysitter who stayed awake after midnight. She became a symbol, not of violence, but of watchful love. A protector forged by pain, who turned her suffering into a shield for others. That's the kind of legacy we often overlook in this world. We search for fame, for glory, for recognition. But Mercy never wanted any of those things. Her greatest triumph wasn't in what she did for herself, it was in what she gave away: peace, safety, and the permission for others to be brave in their own quiet way. To this day, if you walk into certain homes in old towns, places where stories still live in the walls, you might find a lantern sitting near the door. You might hear a mother say, "Keep watch after midnight, just in case." And if you ask her why, she may smile and say, "Because long ago, a girl with no name taught us how to protect what matters." And so Mercy lives on, not in statues or books, but in actions, in instincts. In the quiet heroes who, like her, stay awake so others can sleep.